Hi, everyone. I am Kelly, and this is Vote Her In. Vote Her In is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. And Rebecca is the author of Vote Her In, Your Guide to Electing Our First Woman President, which we very nearly did. Came close to, got the vice presidents, which is amazing. So we are coming at you during Women's History Month, which is great. And I am going to turn this over now to Rebecca, who will introduce our guest. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly, and glad to be here every time we're together, but certainly during Women's History Month, which remains a very special time, although, of course, we should celebrate women every month and every day. And we always celebrate women at Vote Her In, regardless of the month. So we thought that because it was Women's History Month, and I was thinking about the fact, as I'm sure everyone has, that we're, kind of celebrating, if that's the word, we're marking this year of a very different life for everybody. And, one of my most favorite writers on life and what is happening and what we should be thinking about is Heidi Stevens, who writes a column for the Chicago Tribune, has a wonderful group on Facebook called Balancing Act, where she posts and discusses. And we visited with Heidi, I think it was last August. And, the world, we were sort of, I guess, halfway into this pandemic. But the world has changed since then with the election, with all the other, we now are getting vaccinated. I mean, there's just kind of a lot going on. So we thought it would be a great time to invite Heidi back and reflect on what has happened, what we can learn from, what we can be inspired by. So welcome, Heidi. Thanks for joining Vote Her In again. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, especially Women's History Month, but anytime, honestly.
Yeah. So, why don't we begin with, you might want to begin with showing us your t-shirt, since it's just what you're going to be doing today. Yay. Don't we like that? Oh my God, I love it.
That was a Christmas gift from my daughter from Reagan.
Perfect.
Of course, it's Kamala, and she's speaking.
She is speaking, and we are all speaking. So why don't we begin by, if you would just sort of share some reflections, maybe aha moments for you during this last year.
Certainly. I would say an aha moment for me, and it's maybe not a real optimistic one, but it's an honest one. I think what I realized is that we don't, and we will not all come together in a time of crisis, even an enormous crisis that affects every single one of us, not, a crisis that's sort of bound by geography or demographic group, but, this pandemic, potentially and actually affected every one of us. And you would like to believe that would bring us all together. And it didn't. And I think that was an aha moment, and it won't probably in the future. But what I realized is that a lot of us come together in a crisis. And I think that's something that we can build on, honestly, and do a lot of good with. I was listening to an interview one day with Brian Stevenson on Krista Tippett's on, you guys have probably listened to that program on Being on NPR. And he was talking about the concept of stone catchers, which is this idea that we live in a time when, this sort of parable, let he who lives without sin cast the first stone, that's become almost quaint, right? That we live in this era where righteous people are not going to put their stones down, even if they have sinned. They still cast their stones, right? And that means that we need stone catchers, people who will intervene and catch those stones. We have to stand in front of the people who are vulnerable, and we have to catch the stones. And I think that COVID was really telling, in a sense, of who's a stone thrower and who's getting stones thrown at them and who's willing to be a stone catcher. And so I think that was an aha moment for me, not so much like, oh gosh, look at the way it brought us all together, but sort of like, okay, here's what we've learned. And that is that a lot of us were brought together and some of us weren't. And those of us who are willing to stand up and catch some stones need to.
Yeah, and so actually, maybe we can go from there into another question we wanted to talk about, which is, we've been talking to a lot of women on Vote Her In recent months about the sort of structural issues that impede women's progress, that impede equal opportunity for women. And you write a lot about these kinds of structural issues too, on things like sexism and racism and classism that you've been thinking about in your recent columns. So can you sort of draw that connection and things you've thought about, learned about those things, and how does that relate to this idea of sort of who these people are who are stone throwers and stone catchers, and how does that relate to the institutions we have that are putting barriers in place for people to have progress. So I wonder if you could just sort of talk through that, and if you want to talk about your recent column with Woody Allen and Dr. Seuss and the British royal family, it seems to be kind of appropriate here.
Sure. Well, no, I think that is appropriate. I think that's a good example because I think a lot of what we're reckoning with right now is who we listen to, right? And who we historically have not listened to, and who has been harmed by our failure to listen, right? And so, the column that you just brought up was really inspired by a Junia Belafonte column in the New York Times about why her teenage self gave Woody Allen a pass, and how Allen versus Farrow, this HBO docuseries about Dylan Farrow's sexual abuse allegations against Woody Allen, caused Junia Belafonte to revisit Manhattan in particular, which was a 1979 Woody Allen film that Junia Belafonte, watched more times than she could count and loved. And it really sort of helped shape her ideals about adulthood and how she wanted to inhabit the world. And the plot of the movie, for anyone who doesn't know, is Woody Allen as a 42-year-old man dating a 17-year-old Mariel Hemingway. And that's presented as a love story. And the thing that really struck me about Junia Belafonte's column was she said that if that sort of storyline and that the widespread acceptance and celebration of that storyline, a 42-year-old and a 17-year-old sleeping together, if that strikes us as impossible or certainly hard to imagine today, that's only because young women have stood up and said, stop exploiting us, in a way that no one was really willing to do on their behalf, or certainly not enough people were willing to do in a way that moved the needle. Which just, it got me thinking, right, about Dr. Seuss and about the royal family and even the statues that the city is examining right now, and how important it is that we listen, not just to the creators of things and the people with the most power or the loudest voices in any given system, but also the people who are affected and often harmed by that system or that work of art or that person that so many of us revere. So I think a lot of it comes down to get back to your original question, who we're listening to, and are we listening to women? Are we letting women's voices into the rooms and the decisions where we need them to make sure that groups of people, and not just women, but anybody who is marginalized, isn't harmed?
So when you talk about listening to women, that's one of, I think, the most striking changes in this last year, at every level and in every context we can imagine. I wonder if you could share with us, there are obviously the famous examples, and you've touched on some of that just now, but in some of your columns, you've written about women who, in families that have experienced some troubles and come out successfully with the help of other women. And I thought it would be good for Women's History Month if you could just share maybe a couple of those stories about inspirational everyday women who you happen to meet in Chicago, but are everywhere.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So many. I guess, I mean, I can't not talk about the Euros Planet and Taqueria story, which was Erica Sanchez and her husband, Pablo Castro, are both immigrants, Colombian and Guatemalan immigrants, who opened a restaurant in Evanston a year before the pandemic hit. And it was right by Evanston Township High School. And so a lot of their traffic obviously relied on, a lot of their customer base was ETHS students and staff. And, so remote learning really did a number on their business. And despite that, they decided they were going to give out free meals to the community, that they were going to try to feed, in particular, the Latinx community in Evanston that was suffering from food insecurity. And so they committed to giving away 100 free meals a day. And they did. They gave away every single day from April to December, 100 free meals a day. They would just set up a table, fill it with food. Anybody could come by and take it. So she texted me a couple Saturdays ago and she was like, we're closing. We weren't able to make the rent and traffic's just not getting any better. And so we have to close. And I said, okay, would you talk to me about that for a column? And she said, sure. And in that column, I added a line about this Evanston activist, speaking of phenomenal, powerful women, Nina Caven, who runs the Dear Evanston blog. She had kind of on a whim, total long shot, started a GoFundMe to keep this restaurant open. She needed to raise 30 grand in 3 days, which who does right now in a pandemic? And I threw a line in there about that. And like the community stepped up. They knew that Erica and Pablo had worked so hard and sacrificed so much to feed people all over Evanston and surrounding towns. And they hit 30 grand in a day. And Nina upped the goal to 50 grand and they hit 50 grand by the next day. And so here's, they're keeping their business open. And I don't know, that's so beautiful. And I have probably, 3 or 4 other stories just like that, where, there's a woman at the center of it who's not only trying to provide for her family and and live out her dream, right? I mean, Erica's dream was to run this restaurant, but also to give back. She's also feeding the community while she's doing that. And then here's Nina on the side saying, hey, we got to help her along. They're in trouble. Help, come on in. And people answered the call. And I've seen so much of that in the last year. It's really been quite hopeful and really beautiful.
Just to follow up on that for a minute, I think that, it's just too often that these stories don't get, as Kelly was alluding to before, get put in this larger context. And of course, in this story you just told, it is, not only are women at the center of it, but women of different backgrounds, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Women of different classes, different experiences. Was there anything that you observed in that interaction that, you found particularly noteworthy in that respect?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that Nina's doing in Evanston is really trying to get the town and its residents to grapple with some historic racism and segregation and prejudices, and that's why I often turn to her for for story ideas and guidance. And she is a Jewish woman who grew up in South Africa, who arranged this uncomfortable journey to Alabama to visit the museum there. The name is escaping me right now, but the Museum of Racial Justice that was just built by Brian Stevenson, actually, and brought together people of all different races, all different ages, all different religions, and they wanted to take this journey together to experience this museum together and walk across a bridge together. And I think that when you embark on that kind of work proactively and intentionally, that comes through in your willingness to help wherever it's needed, and the lens you look through to find where help is needed, right? It can be very easy to just move in the circles we move in, right? Where our kids go to school, or where our coworkers live, or where we live. And I think that's another lesson from this pandemic, is the way you're experiencing life, the way you're experiencing this virus, the way you're experiencing this she-cession, because the recession really has affected women more than men. The way you're experiencing it isn't the way everyone is, right? So I think we have to really work at getting outside of our bubbles and make sure we're, checking in on the people who don't necessarily live where we do, or live like we do, or look like we do, or worship like we do. So I try to find those stories whenever I can, because, it's my job, right, to cover all of Chicago and what surrounds it, not just some of it. And it also just makes me a better person, and readers better people too. I hope that's sort of my mission.
Now, I know that Kelly has a question about families, and maybe we'll go to that, and then I'll come back to a question about Kamala and the bigger picture that we all have been a part of.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and you write a lot about families. I am speaking with you from my dining room, which has become an elementary school, as you can see from artwork. It's artwork on the wall behind me. And so families obviously have faced enormous challenges in the past year. And you've written a lot about those challenges, but also those successes, the way people have come together in Chicago. Could you talk some about that piece of this, what you're seeing with families and school, of course, being such a big deal over the past year in the inequities in schooling. But what are those stories that you're seeing and that you're reflecting on?
Yeah, I think a huge story is, how many women have felt compelled to leave the workforce or have been forced to leave the workforce because of the demands of e-learning and, lack of childcare during a pandemic, which, is not a thing that you can plan for, obviously. But at the same time, it's a little funny is a nice word I'm going to use, that we are now embracing working from home and telecommuting and meetings over Zoom instead of in person, and all sorts of things that mothers have been saying, and not just mothers, women who tend to be the caretakers in their family. Maybe they're taking care of elderly parents rather than children, or, a disabled sibling, or you name it. Statistically, it's the woman in the family who's caretaking. The things that women have been pushing for a decade, we just now are finally accepting because men need them too. And so there's some irony there. There's also some progress there, right? So, at some point you just wash your hands of why it got the way it is and just celebrate that we got there. So I think women, moms especially, feel a tremendous amount of stress, obviously, a tremendous amount of guilt. I think there's such pressure to keep an eye on your children's academic well-being, mental health, social lives, screen time, physical health, we are still trying to protect ourselves and our families from a potentially fatal virus. In an ideal world, mothers aren't shouldering that by themselves, but we've read enough stories to where we know that many of them are. And, I'd like to believe that this could be a reset of sorts, that on an individual level, that couples are sitting down at kitchen tables, or moms are sitting down with their in-laws or their nannies or whatever, and saying, like, this didn't work. This is not okay. We can't do it this way anymore. And I'd like to think that workplaces are doing that too. That if we hit another roadblock, whether it's a pandemic or something else, we can't watch women leave the workforce in droves. I hope those conversations are happening. But just in terms of like, what are families dealing with right now, I would say tremendous guilt and sadness and stress. And, I've certainly felt all of that myself. And that's with the perspective of, I had COVID. I was hospitalized with COVID. I know that my son's social studies grade is not that important in the grand scheme of things, right? Like, I have that perspective, and still, it keeps me up at night. Am I doing enough for him homework wise? Have I planned enough safe, masked social outings for him? Should I have him in some other tutoring? Is my daughter getting, that's mom brain.
If it makes you feel less guilty, my third grader managed to play hooky 3 times during the winter in the same room as me.
Yeah.
He was just doing something else on the computer and I didn't realize it.
Yeah, we've had that. Yeah. Yeah, you get those emails from the teacher and it's like, oh God. Yeah.
And, related to this conversation about what women have experienced, what mothers have experienced, what other women caregivers have experienced. With the election of Kamala Harris, we have, enormous opportunity. She has a worldwide platform, right?
Right.
To talk about these issues, to make them front and center. And so I'm wondering if you, as you think about the significance of her being there, I think we can all agree that the symbol is great. But if you were whispering in her ear and sharing with her some of what you've shared here, Heidi, what would you say to her about what you think her policy portfolio should look like? What her messaging to the American public should look like?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I moderated a panel about this, the pandemic's effect on women in the workforce, and with the CEOs of Chicago Foundation for Women and Women Employed and all these sort of wonderful change makers in Chicago, right? And they talked a lot about advocating for yourself in the workplace, but also for the women around you and the women who are going to come after you. And I think that's a really good theme for Kamala or AOC or Nancy Pelosi or any of these women who are in positions of power right now, to remember that, we need to be pushing for an increase in the minimum wage. We need to be pushing for child tax care credits and better child care policies and things that keep women in the workforce when things are running smoothly, but also keep them in the workforce when things go sideways. This pandemic taught us how quickly something can go sideways and how you think you're prepared for it and you're truly not. And that will, the two things will feed each other, right? So like, the more women you have in office, the more those policies get championed. And the more those policies get championed, the more women you have in office. So it's sort of, you can't wait for one or the other to happen. You've got to be working on them both simultaneously. It's like the Sheryl Sandberg story about, like, when she worked at Google, not realizing that pregnancy parking was something Google should offer until she was pregnant. and had to walk, 3/4 of a mile with swollen ankles across the whole giant hot California parking lot, because you don't necessarily know your blind spots until, they're right in front of you, right? And we talked a lot on that panel as well about women as employers, right? So if you're employing someone in your home, whether that's a childcare worker or a housekeeper, that you're paying them a living wage, that you're providing them PPE. You're not saying, oh, you can't come in until you have a mask. No, don't put that on them. Provide them a mask, provide them gloves, that little stuff like that you're also being a good advocate and employer of women too, because statistically most of those jobs do go to women: home healthcare workers, childcare workers, domestic workers.
I'm wondering, when you had the panel, I wasn't able to attend, whether there were some key messages there about, for media, for discussions like the one we're having, that for instance, women employed wanted to see the vice president put out there, or CFW. Did you all get into that aspect of it?
Well, the pushing for an increase in minimum wage was a big one. I'd have to go back. We did record it, so I could send it to you. But I think, a lot of it was what we as individuals could walk away and do and put into place. And so it was things like, being a good employer if you employ women in your home, modeling equitable relationships for our sons, having tough conversations with our partners about a fair division of labor, just making sure that we're not contributing to this mass exodus of women from the workforce as sort of the default, like, well, daycare is closed, or, well, school's remote, so obviously mom is going to take a leave of absence, or obviously mom is going to off ramp from her career for a while, to not default to those decisions, but to think about the long-term effects of those decisions. What does that do to a woman's earning power, to her retirement fund, to her ability to get nominated to boards of directors, all of the things, right? To be in a position where you're making hiring decisions. All of that stuff trickles down from the decision to pull back from work when your daycare center closes. So, just to be really mindful of those decisions and see if there is someone else in your life who can pick up a little bit of the slack so you can stay, in your career.
So speaking of work, and maybe we'll close on this note, although I have a sense that we could keep talking. I know we could, but there are, and we had discussed this when we were together last time, there are certainly many women among our listeners who are interested in writing, who are interested in careers where they can write and speak. And I know that you gave some wonderful guidance the last time we were together, but I think this time, because this world has changed so much, and this desire persists. If you could talk about, just for a minute, about how you would help them prioritize what they write about, as opposed to, here's how to go about building your writing career. Because there is so much at stake right now for women, as you've just been pointing out.
That's right. Yeah, that's a great question too. I'll say that one of the things I'm trying to do always, and I don't always succeed, but it's a goal, is to make sure that I'm not just writing about and talking about systems, but also how those systems affect people, right? Not just talking to authority figures, but talking to people who are impacted by the policies and the actions of those authority figures, not just talking to authors or artists, but also the people who are moved by something they read or saw. I think that, it's sometimes tempting to seek out the tastemakers, or the big names, or the important people in elected office or running a company or running a nonprofit, and turn to them for the story of the hour. And I think that to really understand our communities and the people around us, we really need to talk to the people who are affected by those elected offices, right? And those nonprofits and those works of art. And so I try to do a lot of that, not just sort of go to like who has an agent or who has a new book out or who just got, elected to something important, but the people who just live and work in Chicago and the areas around it.
Kelly, any final thoughts you want to share before we say goodbye to Heidi for now, but not forever?
Yeah, well, I was just going to tell my favorite recent story of Kamala Harris, which ties in, I think, to this, what we'd like her to be doing. She visited a yarn store in Baltimore, Maryland. Of course, I'm a knitter, and so this was big news in the knitting community. But it was her way of highlighting a woman-owned small business that was suffering in the pandemic and how they could be helped by the Recovery Act. And then she bought yarn for her stepdaughter, who is a knitwear designer. And the yarn that she bought was yarn that's from a company that's owned by a Black woman that does a lot of social justice stuff. So it was just this really wonderful, like just in this little visit to a yarn store, all the good that she could showcase. So I really loved that. And of course, it's great yarn that I like knitting with too.
All the good that we can celebrate when we see what women can do and accomplish and be inspired by in Women's History Month. So I'm glad you told that story. Heidi, thanks again. It was great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been fun. We'll talk again, no doubt. So
okay, perfect.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.